Yes. Let's see. We were. Can everybody listen here? We were talking about CSS, weren't we? CSS level X. Yes. CSS is divided into levels. Level 1, recommendation of 1996, so that was specified in 1996. When I say recommendation, I mean it was a V3C recommendation, and that's the official state of a specification within V3C. And CSS level 2 in 1998, and 2.1 in 2011, and CSS level 3, which is divided into separate documents. So these are different specifications. And now they are talking about what kind of level the module of CSS is in. And most of those that are coming now are in CSS level 3, but CSS level 4 is also one level of CSS, and there are a lot of specifications related to that which is related to level 4 as well. Yes. Let's move on to another technology that we typically use in web apps and web pages and so on, JavaScript. It's a prototype-based scripting language. And it's object-oriented with prototypal inheritance. Suppose most of you are familiar with object orientation and object-oriented languages. But JavaScript is a bit different in how it handles inheritances and such. I'll come back to that. What does it mean? Prototypal inheritance. Anybody knows? Huh? Partly. In typical, not a programming expert, in typical object-oriented languages, you typically have super and subclasses, and they are inheriting attributes and methods based on their superclasses. Okay. But inheritance in JavaScript is a bit different, and this is quite confusing, I see, in the development community, because there are a lot of complaints on how JavaScript has implemented inheritance, and it's confusing and different from other types of object-oriented languages. So it's not so easy to adapt to in the first place. But typically in JavaScript, first of all, we instantiate a base class, more or less, or a prototype. Okay? But all these base classes have a superclass which is called object. So all inherits from object. That's the base, more or less, the ultimate base class of JavaScript. Okay, so you extend from this class. So if you instantiate a new prototype class, typically you use it, you do it by by writing through, for example, this class with a large first capital F, for example, and you instantiate a new prototype class. But what it does then, it instantiates a new object, okay? So it is in fact an object, not a class, an object. And in that object you have a proto attribute which is a pointer. And that points to the object prototype. And if you use new foo to instantiate a new object, for example, like yeah, you don't have that in this example. Then that would also have an attribute proto, which points to the original foo prototype. So you have pointers that points to the objects that they inherit from. And you always have access to the attributes of these prototypes. But let's say that you instantiate new objects from foo, like bar and boss, okay? And if you manipulate one of the attributes in the foo prototype class, like x, then you will change this value for both bar and boss. You see? Because both inherits this attribute, but it inherits it from the prototype. In the constructor of, for example, boss, you can say that x is a local variable of boss, and then you won't override the x variable of the prototype. This is very different from typical object orientation. You can look more into prototypal inheritance if you want to. I strongly encourage you to do that, to fully understand how JavaScript builds or implements object orientation. Because it's quite different from what you're used to. Okay, JavaScript and DOM. The browser, the client, the runtime environment exposes a DOM API in JavaScript. Libraries like jQuery are higher level APIs that makes DOM traversal and such easier. Because DOM traversal, like traversing between nodes within the DOM tree, is quite complex. It's complex, but you have to remember a lot of functions and so on. It's more complex than it's done in jQuery. For example, you have the methods getElement by ID. That's DOM traversal. You start with a document object, okay? And then you use the function getElement by ID, and you pass a parameter which is the ID. And if it finds that in the DOM, it passes that back to the variable, of course. So foo. And you also have document.getElement by tag name. And several other functions that traverse the DOM in JavaScript. jQuery is built upon these functions, so they utilize the functions of the original DOM, and this is nothing more than a library that uses these built-in DOM API. Suppose many of you have tried jQuery. But there are a lot of different libraries for these kind of things, but jQuery is the most popular now, and has been for quite a while. Okay, JavaScript features. JavaScript is imperative. as many of the object-oriented languages are, and structured. Computation in statements that changes the program states. The opposite is declarative. For example, if you have tried functional program or any functional language, like and closure, different kind of languages. So typical thing with imperative languages is that it keeps state. You can keep state in functions that you run or in objects, and so on. You have dynamic typing, and it's object-based. Dynamic typing, what's that?
When you know types in runtime rather than in compile time.
Yeah, exactly. So if you say that a variable equals 1, for example, JavaScript can interpret that in many different ways. You don't have to specifically state the type of the variable, like you do in Java, for example. You have first-class functions, and this is quite useful actually. Functions are objects themselves and have properties and methods. So you can treat a function as a variable, as an object, in the same way as you treat any other object. And then you have all the methods on a function, actually, functions on functions, on a function object, that it has inherited from the prototypes that it inherits functions from. And as we already talked about, is prototype-based. You use prototypes for inheritance and functions as object constructors. We typically know JavaScript from the browser, but you also have JavaScript for ordinary application development as well, or server-side JavaScript, you can say. But it doesn't have to be server-side. You can build apps on your computer, and if you want to do that as well, with Node.js or IO.js. IO.js was, do you know the history here between Node and IO.js? Because Node JS, there was a community, or you had one company overlooking the development of Node. Have you heard about Node? Yes, many of them have. And then, but it was open sourced, so it was possible to fork this repo, Node repo, and start a new project. And there were some of the participants, some of those that started the development with Node, that were they had different opinions on how to keep the development going into the future of Node. So, how to enforce the development of Node. So they forked into a project called IO.js. So based on the same platform, it's based on the same code base, but it was forked out. And they started their own development of Node, and they called it IO.js. After 1 or 2 years or so, the Node community and the IO.js community agreed upon the way into the future of Node. And then they merged both IO.js into Node again. So now there is one Node, and IO.js is only a thing that passed actually. But this happened last year, I think. But they are both platforms based on Chrome's JavaScript runtime, which is called V8. So it uses Chrome's JavaScript runtime. And you write applications in JavaScript. You have an example there. This is a web server example where you use a module called HTTP. That's an HTTP module which exposes your application to the port of your choice, default 80, so that you can run a web server. And then this module helps you with HTTP request handling and so on. So this is ordinary JavaScript. An HTTP server which responds with hello world to all requests. Have anybody tried Node? Okay. Yes. Let's keep on talking about JavaScript. This is an example of JavaScript and how to instantiate a function, for example. I won't go into detail here. You can look into these examples yourself. Yeah. But you have typical constructs of many programming languages like switches and ifs and whiles and for each and etc. etc. And there are some, of course, quite fundamental differences in the way object orientation is handled in JavaScript, as I said. I will encourage you to look into JavaScript if you're not completely familiar with it, okay? So that you can work with the workshops and the assignments, no, not the assignments, but the exercises and the workshops that we have. It will be quite prominent in these workshops. Ajax. First of all, Ajax is not a technology. It's not an abbreviation of something. It's just a word, Ajax. Popular term that has been popularized during the 2000s. Ajax is several technologies incorporating standards-based presentation using HTML and CSS, dynamic display and action using the document object model, and data interchange and manipulation using XML, XSLT, JSON, or something like that. And one of the most important components in what you can call Ajax is asynchronous requests. Requests that you do besides the original HTTP request response communication of the web browser, for example. And you use the XML HTTP request object for that. And of course you have JavaScript binding everything together. We talked a little bit about this last time, so I'll skip quite rapidly through it. But classic web application model is synchronous. You have a client, it does a request and get a response. Okay? In an Ajax web application model, you have the original request first of all. It should be something like this, yes. And in between here you have user interaction. And maybe based on some of these user interactions, the web application needs to do a request that is not part of the browser's HTTP request and responses based on your addresses. So it's JavaScript requests with the XML HTTP request object to the server. Yes, standardization. Okay, we'll look into some of the standards and the standardization process so that we see how V3C, for example, is standardizing different technologies that we use in web applications. V3C. In the standardization process, you have different maturation steps. How mature is the specification? Typically, V3C starts with drafting a document that specification is based on, and that's a working draft. That's typically the editor of the specification, the one that's responsible for the specification, written by him or her, with some input from those that are interested in this specification. Stakeholders in the specification. Who could stakeholders be in the specification? Let's say HTML5, for example. Who were the stakeholders there, do you think?
Interest groups.
Interest groups. And they represent
Communities. And
communities.
Industry. The industry.
Industry, yeah. Like large software vendors, for example. Microsoft, Apple, Google are typically represented in these interest groups and represented in V3C as well, as part of the working groups in different specifications. So they have a lot to say about this specification process, and they maybe interact on different areas, like seminars and so on. And they, of course, they talk with the editors of the different specifications. But the editors are responsible, and they draft a document of the specification. Then you have a candidate recommendation. This maturity level you have whenever you have a specification that you think can work, but you want to try it against different stakeholders. And typically with candidate recommendation, you get call for implementation, for example. Try to implement this standard in your software and see if it works. Do you have to do something different? Do we have to do some tweaks to the standard? And so on and so on. Then you have a proposed recommendation. That is more or less the recommendation that you end up with. There will be maybe minor tweaks to the specification after that. And V3C is then handling this or discussing this proposed recommendation and says it's an official V3C recommendation after that. So working draft, a published draft of how the proposed standard should contain. What the proposed standard should contain. Significant changes may occur. Candidate recommendation, a more firm version of the standard that is ready to be tested in the development community. Typically, the working group of the standard then calls for implementation, as I said. It goes out a call for implementation. Then they want software vendors to try to implement this standard and maybe publish it in beta software or something like that, test it on real users, for example. And proposed recommendation, the community has given input and the candidate recommendation has been revised. Thus, the standard are ready for approval by the V3C Advisory Council. And whenever it's formally a recommendation and formally a specification, then the standard has undergone extensive review and testing under both theoretical and practical conditions. It is now endorsed as a V3C standard. Typically they also, of course, write roadmap documents to see when the standard should be ready. We can look at the milestones of HTML 5.1, for example, if this link is still active. Let's see. I think it says something about, yes, here. You see that this is from 2014, so I don't think they are following this specific roadmap now. Maybe it has been adjusted. I can't say anything about that. But the HTML 5.0, you have CR start. That's candidate recommendation start. See? During 2013, it should be a candidate recommendation, and LC, let's see. Yeah, that slipped out, so I don't remember what LC was, but CR, then you, in 2014, it should be a recommendation. And HTML5 was a recommendation in 2014. And then you see that HTML 5.1 should be a candidate recommendation last year. Should have been. I don't think it is, as far as I have followed this specification process. And it should be a final recommendation in this year. So we'll see how far they come with HTML 5.1. Yes. And as I said, there are different working groups for different specifications. For example, the CSS modules, there are different working groups for each module. Or one working group is working with several different modules. So they handle the process. Okay, let's move on to current technologies. We have HTML5 with new layout elements, new media elements, and new APIs. HTML5 introduced a new doc type HTML that you have to use in your HTML document to say to the browser that this is an HTML5 document. You have structural elements to mark up your page. This is used for controlling layout and should conserve layout semantics. For example, a header element you typically use, for example, in the header of your document. You can use nav elements to say to the browser that this is navigation container. You can divide your document into sections. These can be reused. You can nest sections and so on. And you can use the aside element to say that this is information that is aside to the section that is in. But in a section element, you also could nest new header article or footer element. And then in an article you can have another section element with header and footer element as well. It's more or less to define context of your semantics. You see? Okay, section, that's a content section. Aside is a content sidebar. Nav is a navigation container. It could be the primary navigation of your web page, or it could be a navigation within a section that is nested as well. Article, that is for self-contained composition. Typically you wrap your blog post in an article element. You wrap your product in, if you show a product in an e-commerce site or something, in an article element. Or a news article, etc. And header footer, it's a heading and footer of a section. You also have new media elements and graphical elements like video, audio, and canvas elements. HTML5 introduces the HTML media element interface, provides methods and events for interacting with media elements. And you have microdata, a way to provide additional semantics to your HTML documents. You remember we talked about that last time? Microdata is part of the HTML5 specification, but there are several different specifications for annotating semantics in HTML documents. There were rich, they are called rich snippets, these specifications, and includes RDFA, microformats, and microdata. But microdata was put in the HTML5 specification, so that's the way to go. Here is a link to a microdata validator that extracts and structures microdata. If you use that in HTML documents and you want to test them, you can use this validator. Okay, let's go deeper into microdata. Microdata is composed of 5 global attributes, so you can use them on any element. Item scope, that's the scope of a single item. So if you have, for example, a div element and you wrap some information in that div element, you can say that the scope of these semantics starts here by using the item scope attribute. You use item prop for assigning properties to elements. Item type, that's a URL that specifies the vocabulary that you're using. Item ref, references to related elements, and you refer by ID. So you have to have some kind of ID on, not some kind, you have to have an ID attribute on the element that you're referring. An item ID, that's a global unique identifier for the element in a semantic context. It's not used any other context than for the semantics. This is an example of microdata. You see that we put item scope here to say to the browser that this is the scope of one semantic element. Okay? Now you will get some semantic data about this object. So you scope your object models. It's using a vocabulary that's called person. You denote that with or say that with item type. And then you have different item properties, item prop. Name, for example, is typically specified in the URL that you use here in the item type. Name, Bob Smith. Nickname, Smithy. We had this example last time as well. You also have a DOM API for microdata elements, so that you can manipulate items and properties. For example, let's see, this sample gets first item of type user and then pops up an alert using the name property. So you document get items, then you get all items which uses item type with this URL. Okay? And then you can say alert something, hello, and use the attribute properties. User properties, and pick the property name, the semantic property name, and use the item value of that element. Yes. Another break? Do you think so? Yes. We'll take 10-minute break this time. I'm a little bit short on time today.